And those sort of observations are critical to me. I mean, I'm grateful because you've come together as a group.
She vanished before sunrise, no goodbye, no warning. And behind those royal walls, grown men were weeping. It wasn't just the absence of words that rattled the palace, it was the echo of her silence. Princess Anne had always been the royal who didn't flinch, didn't falter, and never once walked away from her duty. Until now. The morning she left her private residence in Edinburgh, nothing about it felt routine. There were no scheduled cars, no press briefings, no farewell handshakes. Just one quiet vehicle pulling away before dawn, leaving behind a house full of people too stunned to speak. Inside, her staff, many of whom had stood by her side for more than 20 years, stood frozen in place. Housekeepers who'd memorized her every preference, aides who had shared her daily routine, and security who'd known her not just as a royal, but as a leader, were suddenly faced with a reality they hadn't prepared for. Anne was gone. One footman reportedly whispered, "She didn't leave a palace. She left her family." Tears weren't reserved for dramatic effect here. They came naturally, some in choked gasps, others in silent streams as they realized this wasn't just a relocation, it was a departure. A subtle, seismic shift that none of them could explain. She hadn't even said goodbye. There had been no hint, no meeting, no indication that the woman who embodied unwavering strength would ever choose to walk away. And yet, she did. A longtime housekeeper, trembling as she wiped her eyes, said it best. She wasn't just a boss, she was home. Those who lived in the rhythm of Anne's loyalty knew that something had broken behind closed doors. Because this kind of exit wasn't Anne. It wasn't routine, it wasn't protocol, and more than anything, it wasn't expected. Whispers moved faster than the wind. Staff exchanged glances, each carrying the same unspoken fear of what had happened. What could cause the most dutiful royal of them all to vanish without a trace? To leave, not with ceremony, but in absolute silence? There were no answers in the empty halls or the untouched teacups. Only more questions. And that's when the shock settled into something deeper. Not grief, don't panic, but dread. Because if Princess Anne had walked out, the foundation of the monarchy might be more fragile than anyone had dared to admit. There was no press statement to explain her absence, no family member to fill in the gaps, just her staff, standing shoulder to shoulder in solemn confusion, left behind in the echoes of a life once defined by constancy. But the real shock wasn't in her leaving, it was in what she left behind. What she left behind was more explosive than any royal scandal, a journal filled with truths the monarchy never wanted out. It began with a note. Simple, handwritten, and folded with a kind of reverence that suggested it carried more weight than its few words revealed. Anne pressed it into her secretary's hands just before stepping into that car. No guards, no speech, no last glance. Just 5 words scribbled in her own careful hand. "You have been my home." And with that, she was gone. But it wasn't until hours later that the second discovery would crack open the silence she'd left behind. In the stillness of her private study, a trusted staff member, dutiful, nervous, and visibly shaken, opened a drawer no one had touched in weeks. Inside, tucked beneath worn correspondence and unopened mail, lay something unexpected, a weathered leather-bound journal. It wasn't embossed with any crest. It bore no royal insignia, but it radiated something far more powerful. This wasn't an account of engagements or royal protocols. This was Anne's unfiltered voice. Page after page, ink faded and pages curled, held reflections not meant for history books but for one reader. And whoever that reader would be was about to face a monarchy Anne no longer believed in. The entries began softly, musings on daily life, fragments of memory. But slowly, the tone hardened. She spoke of loyalty, how it had once defined the palace, and how now it was being traded for strategy and spectacle. There were comments subtle but piercing on the changes that swept through the royal corridors after the Queen's death. Not accusations, not outbursts, but something far more unsettling, quiet resistance. She questioned decisions, not out of rebellion, but heartbreak. She wrote of conversations that had disturbed her, promises made to the late Queen, quietly dismantled by those eager to modernize. There were moments when Anne's famously stoic persona cracked. One entry spoke of an emotional confrontation with a senior royal aide, one that left her shaken and silent for days. But it was one line, written with almost painful precision, that froze everyone who read it. The day everything changed, I knew I couldn't stay. That sentence wasn't a reflection, it was a fracture. The entire journal seemed to build toward it. Staff, who caught glimpses of the pages, described the tone as heartbreaking, almost confessional. And yet, it wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. Anne hadn't left because of the scandal. She left because something sacred had been lost, and she refused to pretend otherwise. This wasn't a protest. It was a eulogy for an institution she no longer recognized. The journal didn't name names often, but when it did, it mattered. There were entries on power struggles, on the pressure to conform to an image the Queen would have never allowed. Anne didn't lash out. She observed. She mourned. And then she made a choice. And what changed? Everything started right after the Queen's final breath. Right after the Queen's funeral, everything cracked. One meeting, one insult, and Anne never looked at the crown the same again. The grief that hovered over the monarchy after Queen Elizabeth's passing was thick, but it didn't pause the machinery. Within days, the family convened behind closed palace doors, not to mourn, but to strategize. The world was watching, and the crown had to prove it was still solid, still unshaken. But inside that meeting room, something far more fragile than the image was being tested. Power, vision, and most of all, loyalty. It started with the discussion of how the royal image should evolve. Advisors suggested what seemed like an obvious solution to elevate Catherine. Calm, composed, and respected, the Princess of Wales had become a quiet symbol of consistency. Many in the room believed she represented everything the monarchy needed to project: stability, elegance, and modern grace. But Charles disagreed. Strongly, firmly, without hesitation, he made it clear Camilla would remain at the center. The Queen Consort, he said, was the woman the public needed to embrace. The air shifted immediately. What was meant to be a conversation turned into a declaration. Camilla's name was mentioned more than any other, her role inflated while Catherine's was subtly brushed aside. Anne didn't speak. She listened, observed, absorbed every word. Her silence wasn't passive, it was calculated. And when the conversation veered toward reallocating support away from charities Queen Elizabeth had long championed, that's when the fracture widened. Anne rose slowly from her chair and walked to a window. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She didn't offer a single word. She just stood there, staring out at the gardens her mother had loved so dearly. The room fell into a quiet unease, unsure whether to continue or retreat. No one dared interrupt her silence, and no one could ignore the weight of what it meant. Because at that moment, everyone in the room felt that Anne's disapproval wasn't just about strategy. It was personal, deeply so. Her mother had built an empire around duty, legacy, and grace under pressure. Now, within days of her funeral, the crown was pivoting toward performance, image control, and brand positioning. The charities that had once defined the Queen's compassionate reign were being labeled outdated, their funding quietly reassigned. It wasn't modernized, it was erased. Anne left that meeting without a single confrontation. But that evening, back in Edinburgh, she opened her journal and wrote 8 chilling words. The day everything changed, I knew I couldn't stay. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a resignation in slow motion. The woman who had stood through scandal after scandal, who had never flinched in duty, had been broken not by public failure, but by private betrayal. From that moment on, Anne didn't fight, she faded, but not without purpose. She didn't need to slam doors, she simply stopped showing up. And that silence? It shook the monarchy to its core. There was no statement, no announcement, no memo passed quietly to the press. One by one, engagements disappeared from her calendar. Appearances long scheduled were quietly pulled. Visits were cancelled. Invitations were declined without explanation. And for a woman like Princess Anne, whose entire royal identity had been built on showing up, year after year, event after event, this wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. It was her own quiet language, spoken through absence, and it was deafening. Palace aides tried to manage the optics. Scheduling conflicts, they said. Health precautions. But those excuses wore thin fast. Those who knew her best understood something deeper was at play. Her footsteps, once predictable in the royal corridors, became echoes of a past routine no one could quite replicate. Her seat at formal dinners remained empty. Her notes on briefing documents stopped appearing. Anne, the monarchy's engine of discipline and consistency, was slowly stepping away, and doing so without a word. The royal family was used to rebellion, in loud, chaotic forms. But Anne's protest was different. She didn't criticize in interviews. She didn't write memoirs. She didn't defy protocol with press releases or dramatic gestures. She simply disengaged. It was the kind of resistance that couldn't be spun or silenced. There was no narrative to reshape because she had given them none to work with. Just silence. Deliberate, calculated, and powerful. Insiders whispered of her growing emotional distance, the way her once steady hands now shook when she received updates from the palace. She wasn't angry. She was hurt, not by a single person, but by an entire shift in values she could no longer reconcile. She had served the crown with unflinching loyalty. But now, she watched as traditions her mother once fiercely guarded were replaced by something slicker, shallower, and hollow. Anne hadn't signed up for that kind of monarchy. She never would have. This wasn't a temper tantrum. It was a withdrawal rooted in dignity. In choosing to step back rather than erupt, Anne made a statement louder than any speech could ever deliver. It wasn't about her role or her place in the line of succession. It was about principle. The world outside may not have noticed the absence right away, but inside those palatial walls, her silence echoed through every empty chair she left behind. She was loyal, yes, but she wasn't blind. And when the things she had spent her life upholding began to blur into something unrecognizable, she did the only thing that made sense. She left space between herself and the throne. A space wide enough to let the consequences breathe. But her withdrawal was only half the story. The Queen's final secret was still to come. Hidden in the Queen's private things, Anne found the letter, one that exposed the crown's biggest secret. It was buried beneath a pile of handkerchiefs and personal mementos, inside a discreet leather pouch embossed with the Queen's gold initials. The pouch was old, but unmistakably cared for, stitched with precision and lined with velvet. No one else had touched it since the Queen's passing. It hadn't been catalogued. It hadn't even been noticed. And yet, Anne found it as if it was meant to be discovered by her and her alone. Inside was a single envelope, sealed with wax, the Queen's monogram pressed firmly into the surface. She didn't open it right away. She stared at it, holding it in both hands like a confession too heavy to read, but Anne already knew. Before she ever broke the seal, she could feel the weight of what was coming. When she finally unfolded the paper, her eyes scanned the familiar handwriting measured, neat, and undeniably, her mother's. The words weren't formal, they weren't grand, they were personal, and they were deliberate. This wasn't a statement for history books or heirs. It was a verdict from a monarch to her daughter, passed down in ink, not decree. And in it, Queen Elizabeth didn't speak of Charles. She didn't mention Camilla. There was only one name written with reverence and clarity: Catherine. The Queen called her the calm in every storm. She wrote of grace not taught, but born, of duty not demanded but chosen. She praised Catherine's strength, not for its volume, but for its silence. In the Queen's words, she saw the monarchy's future not in titles or bloodlines, but in character. Do not measure her by title, she wrote, but by the calm she brings to every storm. It wasn't a command, it was a revelation, a final whisper from the one person Anne had spent her life honoring, telling her where the crown should truly rest. Anne didn't cry, she didn't gasp. She folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it in her lap. And in that stillness, she accepted the unspoken responsibility to ensure this truth wouldn't be lost in the noise of tradition. To make sure the Queen's final message reached the one person who had waited a lifetime to be king, not with bitterness, not to shame, but because the Queen hadn't written this letter for herself, she'd written it to protect the crown. And Anne knew exactly what had to be done next. She stared out the window for a long time that evening, alone. No staff, no announcements, just her and the weight of history settling across her shoulders. The palace had changed. The world around them had shifted. But in her hands was the compass her mother had quietly left behind. And while Anne had withdrawn from public life, this letter pulled her back into purpose, not for herself, but for what the monarchy had always meant to be. And now, she had to deliver her mother's final truth to the very man who expected to be crowned unquestioned. Anne laid it on the table and with one sentence, shattered Charles's confidence and William's entire future. The meeting was quiet. No aides, no assistants, no notes. Just three figures behind the heavy doors of Windsor: Anne, Charles, and William. It wasn't a scheduled council or a formal gathering. It was Anne's decision, her moment. She hadn't summoned them out of formality, but out of duty, the kind of duty only she still seemed to understand. And when they gathered in that small room, what awaited them wasn't an agenda, it was the Queen's final truth. Anne didn't make a speech. She didn't preface or hesitate. She simply pulled the letter from her coat pocket and placed it carefully on the table between them. The wax seal had already been broken. Her eyes met Charles's, then William's, and she said nothing. Not at first. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. But then she spoke calmly, without ceremony. "You both need to read this." Charles reached for it, William watching silently. The room, once filled with royal certainty, now held only dread. As Charles read, his face tightened. At first, confusion, then disbelief, and finally, something Anne had never seen in him before, wounded pride. The Queen hadn't written about his leadership, his legacy, or his decades of preparation. There was no affirmation of Camilla's role, no validation of his reign. Instead, there was Catherine. Page after page of quiet praise, unwavering trust, and a vision of the crown tied not to blood, but to character. Charles slammed his hand on the table. The echo startled even William. His voice cracked not with sadness but with fury. "This changes nothing." But Anne didn't flinch. Her reply cut through the tension like a blade. "It wasn't your decision to make." And in that moment, the silence that followed said more than any royal decree could. Charles, the man who had waited his entire life for the throne, had been eclipsed by a message from the woman whose legacy would forever overshadow his crown. William didn't speak. His eyes stayed fixed on the letter, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even shocked. He looked heartbroken, caught between loyalty to his father and the quiet realization that everything had just shifted beneath his feet. The Queen had chosen, not by law, but by conviction. And William, now more than ever, understood that his role was no longer to lead alone, but to follow alongside a woman who had quietly become the beating heart of the monarchy. Anne didn't push further. She didn't have to. The Queen's words had done what decades of royal tradition could not: reset the room, the tone, the power. And as she stood to leave, she glanced back at the table. The letter remained open. Its presence is heavy, undeniable. The kind of truth that couldn't be debated or rewritten. And when that letter hit the table, it triggered something no one could take back. Charles lost his cool. Camilla vanished. And Anne? She walked away like a queen who knew the truth. The aftermath of that meeting rippled through the palace like a silent earthquake. No headlines, no scandals splashed across morning papers, but behind the marble halls and guarded doors, everything had changed. Charles, who had fought so long and so hard to be seen as his mother's rightful successor, was now a man undone. The fury he had tried to contain during the confrontation with Anne spilled out in quieter, more dangerous ways. His public appearances grew more forced. His private mood, more erratic. Staff reported moments of silence that felt suffocating, followed by sudden outbursts behind closed doors. The man who had once stood waiting for his destiny now stood shaken by a truth he never saw coming. Camilla, always careful to stay one step ahead of public perception, vanished from view entirely. Within hours of the Windsor meeting, she retreated to Clarence House and didn't leave for days. She gave no statements, no briefings, nothing. A few aides said she refused to speak to anyone at all, just closed the door and locked herself inside her sitting room. After decades of pushing through scandal and skepticism, she had just been erased by a single letter. Not publicly, but spiritually. The Queen's omission of her name, deliberate or not, had left a mark that no title could cover. Camilla didn't fight back. She simply disappeared. And William? He stood at the center of the storm, torn between two worlds that were no longer speaking to each other. On one side was his father, angry, blindsided, emotionally raw. On the other was Catherine, now silently carrying the weight of a crown that had been handed to her not by ceremony, but by legacy. William wasn't furious. He was conflicted. His loyalty to his wife had never been in question. But what haunted him now was the quiet certainty that the Queen had seen something in Catherine that perhaps he hadn't fully grasped himself. Not just a partner, but a leader. Not just a consort, but a compass. And that realization left him standing on uncertain ground. Inside the palace, whispers filled the spaces that once held confidence. Staff began speaking in cautious tones. Meetings were tighter. Eyes lingered longer. Something had cracked wide open, and though no one dared name it, they all felt it. The crown wasn't breaking, but it was bending, and no one knew where it would land. Anne didn't say a word to the media. She didn't explain herself to anyone, because she didn't need to. Her silence had done the speaking. Her exit had started a reckoning. The Queen's final message wasn't just a document, it was a detonator. And while the institution scrambled to find its footing again, the one person who could have helped guide them through it was already slipping away from their grasp. And just when the palace needed healing, Anne was already gone. She didn't need a parade, just a final note, a steady look, and one last royal room full of tears. Princess Anne had never chased attention, and she wasn't about to start now. Her farewell was not broadcast or choreographed. It was handwritten, quiet, and deeply personal. One by one, members of her inner staff received carefully folded letters, each signed in her elegant scrawl. Some came with photographs, others with pressed flowers or short notes only they would understand. There were no speeches, no drawn-out goodbyes, just moments, gentle, honest moments that struck harder than any royal address ever could. As the car prepared to pull away from the estate, staff lined the path shoulder to shoulder. No commands were issued. No rehearsals were necessary. They simply showed up, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, but all holding something in common: grief. These weren't just employees. These were people who had given decades of their lives in service of a woman who never once asked for praise, but always showed up. And now, she was leaving not just a building, but an era. Many wept openly. Some tried to hold back tears and failed. One senior staff member, voice shaking, whispered, "We served her, but she was the one who gave us purpose." It was more than the end of a chapter. It was the collapse of a foundation. Because Anne didn't just occupy a role in the royal family, she anchored it. She embodied it without ever flaunting it. And with her departure, the palace didn't just feel emptier, it felt unmoored. For decades, Anne had been the monarchy's quiet engine. Over 400 engagements a year, on time, no complaints, no controversies. She wasn't chasing headlines, she was fulfilling duty, steadily, relentlessly, and with a strength that didn't require the spotlight to be seen. That was Anne's rhythm. Predictable, not in a dull way, but in a comforting one. A rhythm the monarchy had relied on without even realizing how much. Her exit was not a rebuke. She carried no bitterness, no blame. She left with grace. But her absence carved a void that no press release could cover up. Because while others may have spoken louder, posed more, and waved longer, Anne's impact wasn't measured by applause. It was measured by presence. The kind of presence that holds a room steady. The kind that, once gone, makes the walls echo. Behind her, memories lingered like footprints in the corridors she once walked daily. The weight of her consistency, the backbone she gave to a family known for its storms. And in walking out, she didn't just close the door, she forced everyone left behind to ask who, if anyone, could ever fill that space again. But while she stepped into silence, another figure was quietly stepping into the light. Anne stepped back, and suddenly, the Queen's secret favorite stepped forward. Catherine's not waiting anymore. She had never asked for the spotlight, never pushed for headlines. While others navigated the chaos of public image and royal theater, Catherine remained the calm center. Steady, reserved, unshaken. But in the silence left behind by Anne's departure, and in the quiet power of the Queen's final letter, everything shifted. Suddenly, the monarchy wasn't looking to its most seasoned heir or the longest-serving figure. It was turning, almost instinctively, toward the woman who had quietly earned every ounce of trust without ever demanding it. Catherine's rise didn't come through announcement. It came through presence. She became the symbol of continuity not because of royal blood, but because of restraint, grace, and a resolve that no amount of protocol could manufacture. And now, with the Queen's blessing made clear in words no one could deny, she wasn't just a consort. She was the moral compass, the living embodiment of everything the crown claimed to be but often failed to uphold. And even Anne, who had once guarded her praise like state secrets, saw in Catherine the future Elizabeth had envisioned but never spoken aloud. William, too, was changing. The son of a king, raised to inherit a throne, now stood beside a woman who many quietly believed could lead it better. There was no jealousy between them, no battle for the crown. Instead, there was recalibration and an understanding that leadership today demanded more than legacy. It demanded trust, and Catherine had it, from the Queen, from Anne, and increasingly, from the people. William began to lean into that reality, no longer towering over his wife in ceremonial rank, but walking beside her as a partner, not a ruler. Meanwhile, Charles remained frozen in the gravity of his mother's final message. The letter had not been a rejection of him, but it had undeniably reframed the monarchy's moral axis. Camilla's absence, Anne's silence, and the whispers growing louder in royal corridors only intensified the weight pressing down on him. He had waited his entire life to reign. But now, the legacy he believed he had inherited was being redefined right in front of him by a woman his mother had chosen, without a title, without a crown, but with purpose. Within the palace, the change was subtle, yet unmistakable. Invitations now listed Catherine's name more prominently. Her voice began to carry more weight in internal discussions. Causes once dismissed as ceremonial now found real traction because she touched them. There was no grand revolution, no royal coup, just a steady rebalancing of power, grounded in quiet strength and public trust. Because while Anne had stepped away with dignity, she had also left behind a challenge, one that Catherine was now meeting with every step she took, not through defiance, but through grace. Not with loud declarations, but by embodying everything the monarchy had once stood for when it stood tallest. So with Anne gone and Catherine stepping forward, are we watching a silent revolution or the rebirth of a broken crown? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.